Silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes after the music stops, after the engines die, after 2,224 souls realize that the mathematics of tragedy are brutally simple. 20 lifeboats, room for 1,178. The North Atlantic doesn't negotiate. It was 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a human being in 15 minutes. The ship was tilting, slowly at first, then faster. The richest passengers in the world stood on a sinking deck in their finest evening wear, watching the impossible become inevitable. This is the story of the final night of the RMS Titanic. But before we talk about how it died, you need to understand what it was. Because the Titanic wasn't just a ship, it was a declaration. A 46,000-ton statement that humanity had conquered nature. That steel could defeat ice. That wealth could buy safety. That progress was unstoppable. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, the freezing void proved otherwise. Tonight, using advanced AI technology, we will reconstruct the Titanic, not as a wreck on the ocean floor, but as it was in its final hours. A floating palace where electric lights still glowed, where orchestras still played, where denial and hope wrestled with physics and fate. You will walk the grand staircase. You will see the first-class smoking room, thick with cigar smoke and confidence. You will hear the laughter from the veranda cafe and the hymns rising from third-class quarters. And then you will watch it all sink into darkness. This is not a story about blame. It's a story about hubris, about the terrifying speed with which order becomes chaos, about how the same steel walls that promised luxury became a prison for over 1,500 people. The Titanic's tragedy wasn't just that it sank, it's that it was never supposed to. To understand the horror of what happened, you must first understand the dream. In 1912, the Titanic was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. It was 882 feet long, longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. Its steel hull weighed more than 46,000 tons. Its 9 decks could carry over 3,000 people. But size was not its selling point. Luxury was. The White Star Line didn't build the Titanic to be the fastest ship. They built it to be a floating palace, an experience, a social event that happened to cross the Atlantic. This is the grand staircase, carved from solid oak, crowned by a glass dome that allowed natural light to flood down through all 7 decks. This was the ceremonial heart of first class. Every evening, the wealthiest passengers in the world would descend these steps in their finest clothing. The men in white tie tailcoats, the women in silk gowns dripping with pearls. The electric chandeliers, cutting-edge technology in 1912, bathed the staircase in a golden glow. At the base stood a bronze cherub holding a torch, symbolizing enlightenment. The message was clear. You were not just traveling, you were ascending. First-class passengers paid the equivalent of $100,000 in today's money for a single ticket. For that price, they lived in suites with private promenades, marble fireplaces, and 4-poster beds. They dined in a room modeled after the Palace of Versailles. They smoked Cuban cigars in leather armchairs beneath stained glass windows. This was the à la carte restaurant, run by celebrity chef Luigi Gatti. It operated independently from the ship's kitchens. You could order ortolan, quail, or lobster thermidor at midnight if you wished. The wine list included 1900 vintage champagne, but luxury was not confined to the menu. The Titanic had a gymnasium with the latest electric equipment, a Turkish bath with heated ceramic lounges, a swimming pool, the first ever installed on a ship, a squash court, a dark room for photographers. There was even a Marconi wireless room, where passengers could send telegrams across the Atlantic at exorbitant rates. Staying connected, even in the middle of the ocean, was now possible. For 4 days, the Titanic was not just a mode of transportation. It was a self-contained world, a microcosm of Edwardian society, floating in a steel shell above the abyss. And it was segregated. While first-class passengers sipped champagne, the world below them was radically different. Second class on the Titanic was still remarkably comfortable, better than first class on most other ships. Families traveling to start new lives in America occupied modest but clean cabins. There was a library, a smoking room, and a dining saloon with long communal tables. But third-class steerage was another matter entirely. Over 700 passengers lived in the bowels of the ship. Immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Lebanon, and China. They slept in cramped cabins with bunk beds bolted to the floor. They shared washrooms. They ate simple meals of porridge, stew, and bread in a plain functional dining hall. There were no grand staircases leading to third class, just narrow corridors, steel gates, locked doors. The ship's designers claimed these barriers were required by U.S. immigration law to prevent the spread of disease, but in practice, they created an invisible wall between the wealthy and the poor. This separation would matter when the water began to rise. On the evening of April 14th, the Titanic was in the middle of the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles south of Newfoundland. The ship was traveling at 22.5 knots, near its maximum speed. Despite receiving multiple ice warnings throughout the day, Captain Edward Smith, a veteran of the White Star Line with 40 years of experience, was on what was supposed to be his final voyage before retirement. He was a man accustomed to success. The sea had always been kind to him. The night was calm, unnaturally calm. There was no moon. The stars were sharp and cold. The ocean stretched out like black glass, not a ripple, not a wave. Lookouts. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood in the crow's nest, 50 feet above the deck, scanning the horizon. They had no binoculars. The pair assigned to the lookouts had been locked in a cabinet, and the officer with the key had been transferred off the ship at the last minute, so they relied on their eyes. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw something, a dark shape, a shadow against shadows. He rang the bell 3 times, the signal for an object directly ahead, and grabbed the telephone to the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. 6th Officer James Moody answered, "Thank you." First Officer William Murdoch, in command of the bridge, made a split-second decision. He ordered the engines reversed and the helm turned hard to starboard, hoping to swing the ship's bow around the ice. For 37 seconds, the Titanic turned. The collision was almost gentle. Passengers in first class felt a slight shudder, a grinding noise like someone dragging a stick along a fence. In the smoking room, men playing cards barely looked up. A few ice chunks tumbled onto the forward deck, and some passengers scooped them up as souvenirs, joking about the interruption. Below the waterline, the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg had scraped along the starboard side for 7 seconds, opening a series of intermittent gashes across 6 watertight compartments. Water pressure at that depth was immense. Seawater, freezing, black, and unstoppable, began pouring in at a rate of 400 tons per minute. The Titanic's hull was divided into 16 compartments by watertight bulkheads. The ship was designed to float even if 4 compartments flooded. 6 were breached. In the boiler rooms, stokers and engineers watched in horror as the Atlantic exploded through the hull. Some men were killed instantly by the force of the water. Others scrambled up escape ladders as the sea chased them. The mathematics were brutal. Thomas Andrews walked through the flooded mailroom and knew 1 hour, perhaps 2. The bow was sinking. Water would spill over the bulkheads. The ship was dying. Captain Smith gave the order, uncover the lifeboats. But there weren't enough. 20 boats, room for 1,178, over 2,200 souls on board. In first class, passengers refused to believe it. The Titanic was unsinkable. They stood on deck in evening gowns and tailcoats, treating it like an inconvenience. The lifeboats launched half empty because no one wanted to leave the warmth. In third class, the locked gates became death sentences. Families pushed through narrow corridors, up unfamiliar stairs, only to find the boats already gone. The tilt became visible, furniture slid, the ocean crept closer, and still the band played. 8 men in uniform, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley. They had moved to the boat deck and kept playing waltzes, hymns, music to calm the chaos. They played as the deck tilted beneath their feet. They played as the water rose. They played until the very end. Not one survived. At 2:17 a.m., the lights flickered and died. The Titanic was plunged into absolute darkness. The generators had drowned. 1,500 people still on board, clinging to railings, praying, screaming. The stern rose, slowly at first, then faster. The massive ship stood nearly vertical against the stars, a black silhouette, impossibly balanced. Then the hull buckled. A sound like thunder. The ship broke in 2. The bow plunged into the abyss. The stern settled briefly, then rose again and slipped beneath the surface. At 2:20 a.m., the RMS Titanic was gone. In the water, over 1,000 people thrashed in 28-degree cold. The screaming was unbearable. The lifeboats floated nearby, many still half empty. Most did not return. The cold killed quickly. Within 15 minutes, the screaming faded to silence. By dawn, the ocean was calm again, as if nothing had happened. The Carpathia arrived at sunrise. The survivors, 705 of them, were pulled from lifeboats, wrapped in blankets, silent, traumatized. The dead numbered 1,517. The Titanic had promised safety. It had promised progress. It had promised that humanity had conquered nature. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, the freezing void proved otherwise. The wreck lies 12,500 feet below the surface now, dissolving into rust. The grand staircase is gone. The chandeliers are dark. The bronze cherub holding the torch of enlightenment rests somewhere in the debris field, but the memory remains. Because the Titanic is more than a shipwreck. It's a warning, a reminder that the universe doesn't care about our ambitions, that nature is indifferent to our engineering, that death doesn't negotiate. On the night of April 14th, 1912, luxury met the freezing void, and the void won. History never dies. It only waits to be remembered.